I'm Suzanne Cloud. I'm director of the Philadelphia Jazz Legacy Project. And before we get started, I just want to tell you a bit about what our organization, our mission, and what we're trying to do here in Philadelphia. Um, we represent the first coordinated effort to identify and preserve original source materials that tell the story of Philadelphia and Philly's vibrant jazz scene and jazz traditions. In fact, the two speakers you're going to be hearing tonight are also on our advisory committee. So I'm really glad that they could do this. If you want to find out more about what we do, you can visit phillyjazzhistory.org, and that'll tell you what we're doing and how to get in touch with us, especially if you have any tapes. So we have an incredible jazz talk tonight, and two giant innovators, as long to discuss a giant innovator. And these two historians tonight are, I'm very excited about having them here. And I'm going to start out by reading our moderator, Steve Rowland, get you to know a little bit about Steve. Um, Steve Rowland wears a lot of creative hats, as do, so does Lewis Porter. He's a producer, director, oral historian, documentarian, educator, musicologist, photographer, radio host. Steve has spent a career using music, theater, and art as windows to explore issues in American history, society, race relations, human creativity, spirituality, aesthetic beauty, the nature of change, and human possibility. Steve is one of the most accomplished music documentarians in the United States, producing over 50 hours of radio documentary work since 1987. All of his projects are based on extensive oral histories. He produced the 11-hour documentary Leonard, Bernstein and American Life, which was narrated by Susan Sarandon. And just to do that documentary, it was based on 100 exclusive interviews he conducted with colleagues of Bernstein and going through mountains of archival material. He also created the acclaimed 8-hour Miles Davis radio project hosted by Danny Glover, which was and also a 5-hour documentary on our subject tonight, John Coltrane, and it was called Tell Me How Long Train's Been Gone. He also has done 2-hour documentaries on a number of musical icons, including Carlos Santana, Music for Life, Patti LaBelle, Gospel into Soul, Frank Zappa, American composer, and Hip Hop 101 on the road with the Roots. Steve has won nearly every award in radio, including 2 Peabodys, a Pew Fellowship in the Arts, Ohio State, Pre Italia, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, New York Festival, and most recently a 2012 National Arts Journalism Award. And I know we can't clap, but what I would usually say at this point is let's give Steve Rowland a big hand. He's our moderator tonight, and I'm so glad he's on this Zoom talk tonight. Second, I'd like to discuss our main man, as we would say. His name is Lewis Porter, and he is our main focus tonight, and his celebrated book, John Coltrane, His Life and Music. He is a well known jazz educator, researcher, and author. In addition to his work as an educator, Lewis is also an incredible jazz pianist and composer, appearing on 30 albums with Dave Liebman, Barry Bart, and many others. His 2018 album, Beauty and Mystery, features John Patitucci, Terry Lynn Carrington, and Tia Fuller. All About Jazz wrote that Porter's music draws from many sources, and he makes, quote, a beautiful creative whole. And New York City Jazz Record adds that he has a, quote, mind boggling array of approaches at his fingertips. He's received a Grammy nomination in 1995 and has performed across the USA and Europe with Dave Liebman. Joe Lovano, Wycliffe Gordon, Ravi Coltrane, and many others. Lewis Porter has a PhD in musicology and was a longtime music professor at Rutgers University in Newark and at Tufts University as well. Lewis has also taught at the New School, the Manhattan School of Music, NYU, William Patterson U, and Brandeis, as well as being a guest teacher throughout the USA and Europe. And once again, I am happy to have these two formidable intellects and talents to discuss the most wonderful musician from Philadelphia, to my mind, John Coltrane, and his many connections to the city and our music traditions. Welcome to everyone who is on this Zoomcast, and to Lewis Porter and Steve Rowland.
Wow. Okay. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being here. This is a real honor for me, and a real honor always to have some time to spend with my great friend and mentor, Lewis Porter, who has taught me mountains of things. And he is really a truly extraordinary force, both as a writer and a jazz researcher and a professor, and also a musician. So, Lewis, I think I know that everybody here already is here because of Coltrane, but I think it's good to start the conversation with just a little bit of an overview of what it is that you think that makes Coltrane so extraordinary and different.
Thanks, Steve. Well, it's interesting because the kind of power of Coltrane and the influence of Coltrane seems, if anything, to be growing. And I find the same thing happening recently, by the way, with some other artists. I think it's also true of Billie Holiday, which is another story. It's somebody else that I've done a lot of research on, but not published. I have a lot of research I've never published. But Coltrane, what can I say? I think his music, obviously for players, is inspirational. But I think it's also important that his life was inspirational. The idea that at a time when drug addiction was becoming a serious problem and hampering a lot of lives, not only in the music community, and causing, people to pass away sometimes. And he said, you know what, I'm really getting my life together in 1957. He said, I'm not doing this anymore. So I think he's inspirational as a person and as a player.
Hmm. Well, let me ask you about that, because the title of your book is John Coltrane, His Life in Music. So talk a little bit about your research and the way that the life and music are intertwined, and why it's hard to understand one without the other.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting that as a player, my original idea was just to write about his music. And the publisher said, well, you have to have, you don't just start in with chapter one, here's a Coltrane record. You got to have a little bit of biography. So I started looking at what was available. Now, this was probably around about 30 years ago, about 91, 92. And what I found was that they contradicted each other on almost every point. What year did he leave North Carolina and move to Philadelphia? Was it 43 or 44? Who introduced him to the soprano sax? Was it Miles, or was it a friend of his in D.C.? And I said, you know what? If I'm even going to write a short biography, I think I'm going to have to research this myself. And what happened is, being a very detailed-minded and somewhat insane individual, that turned out to add half the length of the book again. It would have been about a 200-page book, and it came out to be about 400 pages. And I am a strong believer that the life influences the music and vice versa. I don't like to see books about musicians without either, these days you can have links to music or music notation. I don't like to see a biography of a visual artist without some reproductions of visual art. So I think that it is all connected.
Hmm. Now, tell us a little bit about your own background. Was it at age 5 or 6 that you told your dad, I'm going to grow up and write a biography of John Coltrane?
I think it was 4 actually. Now that you mention it, but since we're based in Philadelphia tonight, people might be interested to know that I was born in Scranton, PA. Now, we moved when I was little, but I actually do know Scranton because both sides of my family were there and we went back to visit a lot. So I actually have the Philadelphia connection. Then we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and I went to kindergarten and first grade there before we moved to New York. So I'm not a native New Yorker, but in a way it was fate that we ended up in New York because New York is a jazz town, you know. And I started to hear jazz by the time I was 11. Before that, I already knew I wanted to be a musician, but I was thinking classical. But I started to hear jazz at 11, and by 13, excuse me, I said, that's my life's work, is to go into jazz.
And then how did you, let's talk about the book and about your research methodology and how you developed it.
Well, it's funny. I ended up through a long chain of events that I won't bore you with, except to tell you that a key person in my life was the African American composer T.J. Anderson, who is retired and living in Atlanta right now, and just turned 90. He'll be 93 on August 17th. And he persuaded me that I had a future in teaching, and I went for a doctorate. But at that time, the truth is, even today, at that time there was no such thing as a doctorate in jazz. Even today, there's frankly just a couple of options. University of Pittsburgh is one of maybe 2 options if you really want a degree in jazz. Well, because I love classical music, it was a no-brainer for me to go for a classical degree. But I did insist on doing my dissertation on Coltrane because by that time, since I was no longer 4 years old, I knew I wanted to do Coltrane. I knew I wanted to focus in on Coltrane. And the only thing I want to mention about that is that I have to say that the training you get in a PhD program of any kind is useful. I mean, I think I'm naturally a kind of a researcher, but it really helped to have some training in it, even though it wasn't specifically in jazz.
Okay. So what are some of the things that when you trained a lot of jazz researchers, so what are some of the things that are really important for your students and their upcoming students to understand about jazz research?
Well, you know, somebody asked me on an interview a couple of months ago, what's your favorite thing about teaching or your favorite feedback, something like that. And I said, my favorite feedback, and I did get this every semester in the written evaluations from at least 2 students every semester, is Lewis doesn't only teach about jazz, he's really taught me how to think more clearly. And I like to think that that is what I'm doing, so it's nice if somebody else agrees with that. And I'm gonna say that therefore probably the most important thing is to always read critically. And I always have to explain to people, critically doesn't mean negatively. People think criticism, you know, and they think, oh, that's negative. To read critically, I'll give you an example that's going on right now. As I told you, I've done a lot of research on Billie Holiday. There's a British author named, he has a not British sounding name, Johann Hari, who's written a book about the drug wars. It has 1 chapter about Billie Holiday, and somehow he very quickly found out that that's his money chapter. So he's doing interviews only about Billie Holiday. If anyone buys the book, which I have a copy of, they're going to find out it's not about Billie. And in the book, he says the government had a campaign to stop her from singing Strange Fruit. So I've done a lot of research on Billie. I said, well, that's interesting. Now, you've probably noticed, those of you in the audience, according to everybody in the press, that's a fact now. Oh, that's interesting. I never knew that. What I tell my students, don't say that's interesting. I never knew that. Check it out. So I look at his footnotes. There's no government records to indicate that that ever happened. And all he has is a comment from Billy where she said, I'll bet if I didn't, it was after she got arrested, she says, I'll bet if I didn't sing Strange Fruit so much, they would be easier on me. And a letter from her co-author, William Duffy, saying, in my opinion, if she didn't sing Strange Fruit, they would have gone easier on her. But that's not, you see what I'm saying? What I teach my students is that's not a smoking gun. That's a hint. That's a guess, really, is what that is. And I've actually seen Billy's FBI file, and there's nothing in it other than it's 12 pages. It's one of the smaller FBI files, and there's nothing in it other than when she was arrested and what for. So it's this kind of questioning, even when everybody says there's a fact, is that what I teach really is to look at it twice and say, well, if it's a fact, what supports that fact?
Mhm. So with that in mind, how would you sort of characterize the status of jazz scholarship right now?
Well, it's funny. I mean, people are telling me I've made an impact, and that's probably just from screaming at my students all the time. But I would like to think that I certainly would. I mean, when I finished my dissertation on Coltrane in '83, it was the second or third time that anybody had done a PhD dissertation on a jazz topic. And it's certainly today it's absolutely accepted that you can do a PhD dissertation on a jazz topic. But what's really changed over the past 25 years, and it's thanks a lot to my friend Bob O'Meally, who teaches in the English department at Columbia. Bob has made a campaign to say jazz is a great topic for a lot of aspects of American society. It's not only for musicians. So there actually are a lot of people doing research on jazz from the cultural side. In fact, the Pittsburgh Journal is called Jazz and Culture. There are people who are doing research on jazz from the literary side, things that have been written that have jazz musicians as characters. My friend Corinne Gabbard is probably the world's expert on films that deal with jazz musicians and jazz topics. He hasn't written about the Billie Holiday film yet. I'm sure he'll get to it. And so I think what's changed is that jazz is being studied by a much broader variety of people, and I would say that could only be a good thing.
Hmm. So let me, when I met you many years ago, I had a kind of a skepticism about other jazz scholars and jazz authors. And one of the things that really stuck out to me about your perspective and about the way you talked about things was an embrace of jazz musicians that was really anti-racist.
Absolutely.
And it was really important that there was somebody of your stature and your knowledge and your credentials who was saying that Armstrong and Ellington and Monk and Miles and Coltrane were in fact musical geniuses. Could you talk about a little bit about that and how you sort of framed all of that?
I'm not going to kid you. When I first became an assistant professor at Tufts University, before that I was a part-time faculty member, and would go to conferences, everybody else there was a classical musician. And they were rude to me, and the undercurrent, in a sense, they wouldn't say this in so many words, but the undercurrent was, why would you waste your time studying that black music? Or one case, a person actually asked me, what is there to study about it? It's not like classical music where you can imagine, oh my God, there's so much to know. And of course, the answer to that is that you could study, there's stuff to know about everything on the planet. So it becomes kind of an elitism thing that it's not even worth studying, is really where that comes from. And but I've always felt one of the first things I ever wrote was in a journal called Black Music Research. And then the first thing I ever wrote was in a journal called The Black Perspective in Music. And the editor, the late Dr. Eileen Southern, who was a brilliant lady, she was another mentor for me, asked me to be an editor of that journal. And what I always feel, first of all, that my being a player helped. But second of all, I grew up in New York. I played at jam sessions in Harlem And in the Bronx, in many cases, I was the only white person in those jam sessions. And so, even though I am a white Jewish person and I'm a person that you could say is outside of the black world, I certainly always was involved and working with black musicians and with black people, and feeling that I had a sympathetic point of view that maybe not everybody did.
Mhm. But it's important. I would assume you agree that it's important that we embrace the see I not the talent of African American musicians, but the cerebral genius.
Yes, absolutely, because you're right. But even some of the people that said they're great players, then they would add a disparaging comment like, and isn't that amazing that they could do that when they don't even know anything about music? And I will tell you, I won't mention the name, but there was at one time one of the leading professors at Berklee College of Music. Now, he's since passed away. I probably could mention the name. But who said to me, don't you must know, Lewis, trying to appeal to me, you're a scholar, you must know that the only reason black musicians play the blues is because they're wiggling around between the pitches and they can't really find the right pitch. And I said to him, I immediately just responded viscerally, and I didn't censor myself. I said, that's ridiculous. If you listen to Bird or Sonny Rollins, it's very clear that's exactly the pitch they want. He said, oh, I'm sorry. So this is how people were getting taught at Berklee College.
Hmm, amazing. Okay, let's shift and talk. I'm trying to keep my eye on the clock here. We don't have like a ton of time. Um, let's shift and talk a little bit about Philadelphia, or a lot about Philadelphia. Why don't you give us a little brief overview of Coltrane's early years in North Carolina, his family life, and how he and his mom ended up in Philadelphia?
So Coltrane was born on September 23rd of 1926 in Hamlet, North Carolina, and then when he was just an infant, his family moved to High Point. So in a way, High Point's really his hometown. They have a statue of him now in High Point. There's a local banker, a really good guy, a black guy named John Morton, who's kind of a mover and shaker in recognizing that that's really his hometown. That's where he grew up. He went to high school. And in doing my book, I spoke to a lot of people who went to school with him in High Point. And in fact, I'll share my screen for just a second. Oh, well, my share screen is disabled. But in my book, you'll find a childhood photo, which had never been published before, that I got from one of his schoolmates of Coltrane in elementary school in one of his classes, which is it's a priceless photo. And let me just see if that's changed. No, that's okay. And I have all the other photos in my book were previously unpublished photos. And so what happened is when he was about 13, he got interested in playing music. He said his original favorite was Lester Young, who of course was a tenor saxophonist, but usually younger boys and girls, when they start the sax, they start on the alto because the alto sax is it's easier to carry, it's smaller. By the way, just so you can see it, there's that picture. And this is Coltrane right here. If you can see my cursor, that's his with his hands in his pockets. Isn't that priceless? I love that photo. So,
Can you show the picture again? I want to tell you a quick little story.
Oh, okay.
A few years ago, I was asked to give a workshop for elementary school here in Seattle, and it was a public school in the city. This particular one, it was mostly white and Asian students, only a couple of African American students. But it was a workshop on Coltrane, and I showed them this picture, and I asked them, "What do you notice about this?" And they were like, "Oh," they immediately said, "There's no white people."
Right, exactly.
And then we talked about the issue of segregation, and the students got it completely. They totally understood it. It was very interesting.
Yeah, because if you do the math, as I wrote under the photo, this is the South in 1934 to 35.
Mm-hmm.
So absolutely, there were separate schools. And two of his classmates said to me, we're a little disappointed that he didn't keep in touch. And we even had reunions and stuff, and he never came. And it seems to me, I think we kind of mutually agreed as I was talking to them on the phone that maybe he didn't have great feelings about the South. Maybe he didn't want to go back there. You know, that's certainly possible. So um, he moved to Philadelphia after high school. And it turns out Philadelphia was a great place to be a jazz musician. Okay, I'm going to say maybe it still is. Probably it still is.
Yeah.
I've done concerts there with Bobby Zankel and Odine Pope. There's a lot of great players. It's a great scene. And in the 50s, late 40s and 50s, when he got there, though, there was a very particular kind of scene, and it's still going on to some extent, which was a heavy emphasis on mysticism and music theory and kind of connecting them together in interesting ways. So a lot of musicians from Philadelphia are famous for having what they call their own system. So, for example, the late Jimmy Merritt, who was a lovely man, I spoke to him on the phone a couple of times, and I know his son Mike, who's been a bassist for the Conan O'Brien show and all these things. Jimmy Merritt, outside of Philadelphia, nobody knows this. Now, you Philadelphia folks know that he was a very innovative composer who had a system of composing that you really had to learn it. It wasn't easy. Bobby Zankel told me he really had to focus in because there were symbols that he used on the music notes. It wasn't just standard music notation. Well, that kind of thing was going on even back in the 50s. Jimmy is an extension of that. And one of the key people, by the way, another person that I'm involved in researching right now is what we call the legendary Hassan, or Hassan ibn Ali. And in fact, I see that one of the participants today is my friend Alan Sokornik. Alan is a New Yorker who went to University of Pennsylvania. Through one connection or another, got to know Hassan, and he got to really like Hassan. And everybody thought Hassan was strange, and Alan kind of got him. He said he's funny, he's witty. He said, I don't think of him as strange. You know, okay, maybe strange, but also funny and witty. Hassan was very well known as a teacher of kind of mystical, theoretical ideas. Did Coltrane hang out with him? Absolutely. In fact, at one time it was known that there was a 15-minute tape of Train and Hassan, but I asked all the involved parties, who included the late Bill Barron, and everybody agrees the tape no longer exists, which is too bad. But he was probably the main mentor to Odine Pope. Odine told me that to this day he thinks of that as his main mentor.
Absolutely.
In fact, Odine's first recording at the age of 26 was an unissued quartet session with Hassan. So what's the punchline? The punchline is most people here will know the trio album by Hassan that Max Roach plays on and was responsible for getting it to happen. But I contacted, Alan pointed out to me that this quartet session maybe it still existed. I did the research. We found the session. I got a record label involved, and that's coming out in April. So people are going to get to hear a real kind of Philadelphia amazing discovery, because there's a quartet session of Hassan doing his own music in 1965. It'll be out in April 23rd.
Great. And when we should just mention quickly that my old friend and probably yours, the great bassist from Harrisburg, classical and jazz bassist Art Davis, was on that trio record with Max Roach and Hassan.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And I should mention he's on this quartet too. Absolutely. And he sounds great. He plays great on it. Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous human being, fabulous bassist.
Can I butt in a second, guys?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. I don't know if you have that picture of Coltrane with Ray Bryant and all those Philadelphians around him.
Absolutely.
Can you show that? It's very cool. And I'd like to mention, where you're getting that up there, that we are going to have one of the Philly Jazz Talks for Zoom about the Hassan recording that's coming out.
Oh, beautiful.
So I might be asking you to come back again.
Absolutely. So Ray Bryant was a lovely man. I don't know how many people in the audience actually knew him. It was really a pleasure to talk to, and very generous. He told me, I didn't have to drag it out of him. He said, you know, I have a photo of myself with Coltrane that was never published. I said, well, I could come by and get it from you. I'm in Manhattan and it was out in Queens, I think. He said, no, I'll make a copy and mail it to you. And so he did. And as you can see, it says underneath it's Little Ray Bryant is in the back there. He joined the Musicians Union in Philadelphia at 14, which set a record at that time. Maybe still I don't know if he's still the youngest, but here's Coltrane with a beautiful big smile on his face. There's Shuggy Rhodes. There's Sax Young, and this is Johnny Coles, who I briefly spoke to for my book as well. So that's a great photo. I love that.
Yeah. So, Louis, can you talk for a minute about this panelizing thing that you brought up? Like, how would you explain this connection between mysticism and music theory?
Well, it's interesting. Some of it is numerology. So, for example, the musicians will know. I have my piano right here, so don't be shocked if people can't see the piano. So they're going to say, "Oh my God, where did that sound come from?" But so, for example, they know that Coltrane was interested in chords that moved by thirds. So that means instead of, it means it's that kind of movement. These kind of sounds. And the idea of this kind of thing was, yes, it's a musical thing, but it's not only to be abstract or whatever, because it also ties in with visual things. So Coltrane drew triangles, see, with one of the keys at each corner of the triangle. Then he made it like a Jewish star with the other corners. He said, oh, wait a second, you can go to these corners and put the names of keys at each corner of the triangle. These drawings exist. Some people may have seen them. They've been reproduced in my book, also on the web, and also in my other book that maybe we'll talk about, the John Coltrane reference. So so in a way, it's like the idea is that the theory isn't only for its own sake, but that it somehow reflects interesting realities of the universe, you could say.
And do you think that this had a lasting effect on Coltrane as he got into his later music?
Absolutely, and in fact, he continued to explore things like this in his own ways. And there are little sketches that he made for himself. Trying to think if there maybe even one in my book, where he's saying things to himself like 6 and 4 plus 2 plus 1, you know, and you're like, excuse me, you know, what is this all about? But apparently he was thinking about numerologic patterns and things like that. And you might hear him just play something. You might hear him play something that simple, but he's thinking 2 of these and 3 of those and 1 of these and 2 of those. You know, he's making some kind of connections with the numbers. You know.
Well, I want to get back to Philly in a minute, but while we're here, let me ask you this. Coltrane, as you have said in your book, Coltrane was not a child prodigy, or he didn't appear to be a child prodigy. So one question that we have is, how is it possible that a person who's not a child prodigy can end up becoming one of the greatest musicians of all time?
Yeah. I've got to tell you, there is a private recording session. It's 8 tunes that Coltrane made when he was in the Navy with friends, actually an interracial group of friends, because the Navy was still segregated. And he never thought anybody was going to hear it. But he plays the alto, and he does not sound amazing on it. I guess that's the punchline. And whenever I play that, I'm just looking up something here. If I can find it, I'll show it to you. But in any case, I have a photo of that session in my book, which I'll show you very quickly. And whenever I play those recordings for musicians, it's funny, it happened to me 4 times that at the end of the recording, I could hear them go, like that. I said, all right, what is there? That's a photo of the session.
Right.
I said, what is this? What are you sighing about? And they said, well, I'm 19 and he's not much better than I am. So that means there's hope for me yet. And it was funny, but that the same answer the next time I asked. So it's interesting that he's a great example of how it's not only talent, it really is talent and hard work that makes it happen, you know. Because clearly he had the talent or he never could have gotten to where he got to. But he wasn't there right at the beginning. Bird made records when he was 20, and he does not sound the same as he sounds later, but he sounds beautiful. He sounds absolutely fantastic. Coltrane, on this first recording session, which he, as I say, he didn't expect people to hear it, actually hits wrong notes. I mean, he makes mistakes, you know. That stops in a couple of years. By the next time he recorded was 1950, and all of a sudden there's no mistakes anymore, you know.
Yeah, I think it's.
So
I think.
I was going to ask a question real quick since you're on this. Since you're talking about his development as a musician, what do you think him playing with the local groups, the organ trios, like with Shirley Scott and whatnot? How did that affect his playing or his development?
You know, Coltrane had a great attitude. You know, there's what I call pretend humble. Pretend humble is when people go, oh, shucks, you know, but he actually was really humble and beyond where he should have been. You know, like he really thought he wasn't that great. He absolutely felt that all the players he was with were his equals. And he was asked once by my late friend Francois Postif, who was a French interviewer, and Francois asked him, what about all these rhythm and blues bands around Philadelphia that you were playing with in the early 50s? He said two interesting things. One is he said, I learned something from everybody I ever played with. He never said that was beneath me and why did I have to do that. You know, he said, I learned something from everybody I ever played with. And he named names. Earl Bostic, for example, he said, I learned a tremendous amount technically about the saxophone from him. And then the other thing that he said is, Francois said, well, did you try to be innovative? Did you do your wild stuff? He said, no. I saw too many guys get fired for screwing around. That's a quote. And I learned very quickly to do what was required of the gig. And I didn't try to play my wild stuff. I worked on that at home during these periods. So that was interesting. In fact, I have, over the past few years since my book came out, but in time for us to mention it in the reference book, they discovered a track of him playing with a Philadelphia rhythm and blues band. So I'm just going to play you a few seconds of this. You'll find this interesting. This was a drummer from Coatesville, and his nickname was Coatesville Harris. I forget what his...
Harris.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He actually played with Louis Armstrong's big band. You know, he was a very good drummer. And they got a singer and made this record in 1953. It was on a very obscure little label that disappeared. And it's politically incorrect. So I will preface it by saying that just before Coltrane plays, you'll hear the guy sing. The title of the song is Strange Things All the Rage, meaning there's so many strange things going on these days. That was a big hit for other people too, by the way, and or some kind of a hit. And the lyrics say, you see two women together and one of them's acting just like a man. And he's like, oh my God, you know. And then Coltrane Solos. Oh wait, let me make sure. I'm sorry, I have to make sure I'm sharing the audio too. Okay, here we go. Just a minute of this.
When you see two women walking hand in hand, one talking like a woman, the other like a man. Strange things, all the rage. Baby, excitement's what I crave. Don't be dead until you're in your grave. Baby, we are living in the atomic age.
Sounds good, doesn't he?
Oh, that's great.
He sounds terrific. So that was we're still occasionally coming up with stuff, you know, which is kind of interesting. That's Philadelphia.
Yeah, right.
Local Philadelphia band, 1953.
So let's talk a little more about Philadelphia, Louis. What, you know, this period of music and during the 1940s and 1950s, describe what are the outlets that African American musicians have for getting music education and some of the creative ways that people like Coltrane got their music education.
Well, Coltrane, as I say, had been in the Navy for 1 year, but that did qualify him for what they called the GI Bill. And the
Mm-hmm.
GI Bill was astoundingly generous. You could go to almost any school. It didn't have to be a quote unquote accredited college. So he used that GI Bill to do some studying at two different schools in Philadelphia. One was the Granoff School, one was the Ornstein School. And then he studied privately on and off for a number of years with the legendary teacher, private teacher, Dennis Sandoli. Now, I'm not sure if the bill covered that as well. I did interview Sandoli, and I didn't think to ask him that at the time. It would be interesting. But he actually got a terrific education. I will tell you something about music schools, though, which is interesting. Did you know that music conservatories everywhere on the eastern part of the United States, even including Philadelphia, not only on the ocean, were some of the first American colleges to accept black students? Boston Conservatory, 1863, first black student. New England Conservatory, 1864 or 5, first black student. Curtis Institute, by the way, another thing that people need to double check, those people in Philadelphia probably know this. Nina Simone used to curse out the Curtis Institute. I can't believe they didn't let me in. It must be because they hate black people. And at the very moment that she was rejected, they had a black woman who was a major. And my colleague at Rutgers, who had the office next door to me for years, George Walker, a famous black composer, was a graduate of Curtis. So the truth is the music schools were surprisingly open to, surprisingly integrated, I guess you could say.
Hmm. I do have
All
to
right,
say,
I wanted to kind of break in here because we're getting, we have a few questions that people are asking. You guys ready for some questions?
I just want to answer one question that someone's going to ask, which is, my book came out in 1998, and people are always asking me, what about a new edition? So what I want to say is, I have to be honest, at the moment, there's no plan for a new edition. It could happen at some point. But this book that is called the John Coltrane Reference, I put together a team, myself and 4 other authors. It's a huge kind of a day-by-day chronology and discography. That is a tremendous amount of information that supplements the chronology in the back of that book and way updates it. And the other thing, at WBGO Radio, I should do this for our friends at RTI, but at WBGO Radio, I put up updates to the book, and at this point there are actually 7 long essays. So for example, some of you know there was an album that came out a few years ago called Both Directions. I have a long essay about the whole history of that music with some information that's not in the liner notes to that. So those are 2 ways that I'm getting information out there.
Okay, well, and before we leave to Steve, I'd like you to mention talk just a little bit about your documentary, your your documentary on Coltrane, because we have a question about that. Okay, let me see. Hi, Lewis. Nice seeing you virtually. Somebody's saying your lovely wife too.
That's nice.
But Suzanne, let me just, I just saw a note from Jack about Roland Wiggins. I just wanted to.
That's a good one.
Sure.
Yeah, let's go there.
Roland Wiggins was, and this is actually, I was going to mention this to you, Lewis. I did an interview with Roland Wiggins many years ago. He was a child prodigy.
Yeah.
And he got an audition at the Peabody Institute. Is that what it's called in Baltimore?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And one of the composers there, was a little skeptical and took him through his paces. And it's a long story, but anyway, he said, "Listen, you're a total genius, and I want you to come and be my student. I'm going to give you a full 4-year scholarship."
Wow.
He went home and he got his things, and then September came and his parents got him to school. He put on his little suit.
Uh-oh.
He was up there, and the people at the desk said, "There must be a mistake. We don't take colored people here."
That's
And
terrible.
they kicked him out.
Because he was revered.
Yes, he was.
And the composer quit his job over that.
Is that right?
Ah.
That's what Rowland told me. Now, and then the
Okay.
question that Jack asked was it true that Coltrane studied with him? What I recall Rowland telling me, it wasn't like a formal study, but Rowland was on the scene in those days as a kind of a consultant to advanced jazz musicians.
Right.
who were
In
working
Philadelphia.
in Philadelphia, maybe, and in New York too. But he was
Oh, New
living in
York.
Philly.
Okay.
Rowland lived in Philly. He lived in Germantown. And
I wonder if he had a North Carolina connection, because I have an interview that someone else did with Roland Wiggins, and I thought it was late in Roland's life and it was done in North Carolina, but I could be misremembering the location.
well, he lived in Charlottesville, Virginia for.
I'll bet that's what. Okay, that makes sense. This guy was a Virginia guy who did the interview. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, super sweetheart and a genius. But that was more of his role, was as a consultant with people like Miles and Coltrane, who were working at the very upper echelon of music theory.
That wasn't so much a teacher of Train, but somebody that they hung out and talked music. It was that
Yeah.
kind of a thing.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we have another question from Ben Bloom. Do you know the Coltrane Mandela? You guys
Ben's
familiar with
referring
that?
to those drawings that I talked about. And I don't know if I could find them right now, but those are the triangles within
Oh.
triangles within circles. So that's what it is. Absolutely, yeah. And those, you can find them if you Google around or look into my book and other books. Yeah.
Okay. Now I had heard, let me ask a question here, because Johnny Coles I knew personally. He was a lovely man.
Oh, that's great.
And I was lucky enough to get a chance to play with him a few times. But I heard that he was the one that that stood by Coltrane when he was detoxifying from heroin, and he was the one that came to the house, and he would kind of like slide food under the door, so he just stayed. Was Train was just staying in his room, and I had heard that Johnny was the only one who he'd let even near him while he was going through that. Is that true, or is that just
that's interesting. I have heard that, but unfortunately, towards the end of his life, Johnny Coles was not in great health, and I only got to talk to him for about 10 minutes. I did get some good information about the first gigs he did with Train, which was touring with Eddie Cleanhead Vinson. They were in that band together.
Oh.
And so that was kind of amazing. Red Garland was on piano. What a band. In 1948. And but the interesting thing about that week that Coltrane was quitting cold turkey, as they say, is that according to several people that I spoke to, the late John Glenn, Vance Wilson, and a few other Philadelphia cats, Coltrane actually had a gig that week, and he was going to play at night, but during the day, he said to a close friend, and now you're making me think it must have been Johnny Coles. He said, when I get into trouble is hanging out after the gig. He said, I've got to get straight home, and then I've got to stay home during the day, or I'm never going to make it through this week. So he wasn't actually home 24/7. It's a little different than the picture, but I'm sure Johnny Coles being there meant a lot to him. Absolutely.
Well, both Johnny and cousin Mary told me he just sat outside his door in the house.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's great.
All right, we have some other questions here,
Hold
guys.
on a second. Lewis, I want to ask you a question about what do you think, Lewis? Beside the fact that heroin was sort of in fashion, what do you think was going on with so many musicians turning to heroin? And then also, this is a sort of complicated thing, but what do you think was the role of Islam in Philadelphia in helping people get away from alcohol and heroin?
I'll give quick answers to both of those. But the heroin thing, sadly, did have something to do with Charlie Parker. And Bird was very upset about it. He told Sonny Rollins to his face, he said, this is very distressing to me that you would go on heroin because you think somehow that that's what I'm encouraging. Leonard, the late Leonard Feather, who was kind of an activist of sorts in a number of ways. He also produced some of the first women jazz musicians recordings. He asked Bird in an interview on the radio, said, this is an opportunity for you to tell people, should they be doing heroin in order to play like you? And Bird said on the radio, and that radio interview still exists, he said, absolutely not, and I don't feel that I play my best when I'm high. So unfortunately, a lot of people thought And the late Jimmy Heath, Jimmy even told me, he said, Bird once played my horn. And I thought to myself, how come he can make this sound so amazing? Something to do with the heroin. And in fact, Jimmy was a very honest and funny guy.
Yeah.
I know that you knew him as well. And he said to me, I'm going to be honest with you. He said heroin was amazing for practicing because you could practice 10 hours and you could never do that without heroin. You'd say, oh, I can't take it anymore. You had incredible focus. He said, I'm not recommending it, but I'm just saying there are reasons why people got addicted to it. The
That's
other thing
interesting.
was social pressure. So my late friend Don Friedman was a lovely pianist who looked very scholarly and academic. He was a little Jewish guy with glasses, and he talked like this. And I said, Don, did you ever do heroin? Now, Don was born in 1935. He's 9 years younger than Train. He said, honestly, he said, in my generation, you couldn't not try heroin. I said, really? You tried it? He said, I did do it. And luckily, I guess I'm not an addictive personality. He said, not everybody got addicted to it. So I think the pressure was very strong. And I think you're absolutely right, Steve, that that's a positive aspect of Islam, that it says, forget about alcohol, forget about drugs. You don't need that, you know. And that was a big movement in Philadelphia. But interestingly, Train always saw himself as kind of an independent. He said, he said in an audio interview that some people hear. I actually was discovered by a collector friend of mine while I was working on the book, Norman Sachs. A guy named August Bloom, just a fan, did the interview with Train in 1958. And he asked him, he said, what are some of your religious ideas? And Coltrane said, well, you know, all I knew about was Methodist. It was actually AME Zion, African Methodist Episcopal Zion. He said, all I knew was Methodist. And in Philadelphia, I found out about Islam. And I said, whoa, another religion? But he spent the rest of his life trying to explore religions generally. He did not want to be pinned down to one religion. And even though he married Juanita, who was known as Naima, her Muslim name, he never became a Muslim. He wanted to be kind of an independent, and he envisioned A Love Supreme as a kind of an interfaith piece of music, not a Christian piece of music. That's why there's no overt Christian references in it. I should mention just one more thing about that, because one of the most important things in my book that people always keep mentioning to me is that I pointed out that on the last movement of A Love Supreme, Coltrane is actually playing the words. He starts by playing, A love supreme, I will do all I can to be worthy of thee, O Lord. And that's explained in the book in detail, but also online on the WBGO site, I have 3 long essays about A Love Supreme with tons of information not in my book. In fact, the 3 essays together are about 12,000 words, which if you do the math, you'll find out that's a lot of stuff.
All right, we have another question here from Diane Turner. She's the curator
I know
of
Diane, sure. Hello, Diane.
the Bloxon collection, where we hope our eventual archives will be housed. All right, her question is this. A.B. Spellman wrote in Ebony magazine in 1967 that, quote, a man like Coltrane was playing something consciously black, no matter how abstract his formulation may be. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. And by the way, I hope Mr. Spellman is doing all right. I know him a little bit. I haven't seen him in some years, but I was involved in reissuing his book. I got it reprinted, called 4 Lives in the Bebop Business, or sometimes I think the new title is 4 Lives in the Music Business. And Coltrane's music comes deeply out of the black experience. And the blues, Archie Shepp said, I call him the blues man. And I thought about that for a minute. I said, that's funny. So when you think of a blues man, you think of somebody with a guitar. But then I thought about it for a second. I said, not only is the blues in everything he plays, but he plays a lot of blues. In fact, it wasn't unusual for him in the 60s to have, in one set, to have 2 long blues. He would do Mr. PC, and then he would do Cousin Mary in the same set. So that's a lot of blues in 1 hour of music. And the other thing is that in a funny kind of abstract way, for those musicians in the audience, some of the abstract stuff that he does, almost, I'll play a little bit, try to keep it a little softer, but it's almost like extensions of the blues. This kind of dissonance over the chord, it's almost like an extension of the blues, which starts with the basic. Blues begins with a dissonance. It begins with this. So you start extending that and you get all kinds of things.
Wow. Okay, we have another question. Good question, Diane. Loved it.
Thanks, Diane.
Did Coltrane study with Barry Harris like Paul Chambers did?
Yeah, well, you know that Barry and Paul were Detroit people. Now, Detroit's a great scene too, but it's a different scene, and even the approach to theory was different. So Coltrane actually didn't know Barry until Barry came to New York, which I think was 1961, to work with Cannonball Adderley's group. I don't know if he came to work, but he ended up right away, got a good gig with Cannonball Adderley's band. And of course, Barry's still around. You can ask him this, but my understanding from having met Barry, in fact, I gave him a room to teach at Rutgers when he was in between studios for a while, for a year actually. My understanding is that it's another example of hanging out, but not any kind of a formal study, especially because by 61, Train was a teacher for a lot of people. He was well into his own ideas by then. But Barry's brilliant, and what Barry did was different from the Philadelphia approach. His approach was almost like a pragmatic approach. How can we take all this millions of notes that Bird plays and reduce it to an understandable scalar outline, which is what he did in a really brilliant way.
Okay, we have another question from Anthony Creamer, who is, he told me earlier he was related to Cousin Mary. He wanted you to speak. He wanted you to talk about the Coltrane Ellington date.
Yeah, that was of course Bob Thiele's idea. One thing I haven't written about yet, but it's kind of interesting, is I've learned in recent research that the usual story that Bob Thiele told, he was Coltrane's producer on Impulse Records, and the story, I'm sure you've heard this too, Steve, or maybe got it from Bob, I talked to Bob once on the phone, is that with a guy like Coltrane, you don't tell him what to do, whatever he wanted, that was fine. What I've learned is that that's actually not true. Bob Thiele pressured him regularly. He said, we hired you just after you had a hit on Atlantic Records, My Favorite Things. We're looking for another hit. So Coltrane said, okay, let's try Greensleeves. So on the very first Impulse album that Coltrane did, they put Greensleeves. Well, that didn't become a hit, really. All right, how about Chim Chim Cheree? All right, let's try it. Coltrane said in an interview in 1961 to Ralph Gleason, and I have the tape of it, courtesy of the family, which was nice of them, but you can read it now in the Ralph Gleason book of interviews. He says, I'm always looking for another Favorite Things. Now, that's 61. That's when Bob Thiele is pressuring him. That's not an accident that he says that. So the Ellington date was Bob Thiele's idea for a very small window between Reprise Records and RCA contracts. He was able to get Duke for some small band stuff. And he had Coltrane. He said, what about doing something together? And the famous story from that, but probably most of our listeners know it, is that at the end of one of them, Coltrane said, let's do another take. And Duke said, you know what? It's diminishing returns when you do a lot of takes, which those of us who have been in the studio will agree it's basically true. I mean, you can do 2 takes, maybe 3, but when you keep going on, it doesn't get better. You're not going to get that magic performance. And Bob Thiele always said that made a big impression on Train, and he noticed after that Coltrane started to do fewer takes, which is kind of an interesting story.
Oh.
I want to hold on a second. I want to share something about my interview with Bob Thiele, who I thought was a really lovely and wonderful person.
Yes.
He was an interesting guy because he was coming from the swing era.
That's right.
And his wife was a swing style singer.
Yep.
And that was his frame of reference. And now he's here, managing and producing Coltrane. And on one hand, he came up, I'm pretty sure, with the Johnny Hartman and Coltrane.
That's right. Yes.
And he was definitely looking 4 hits, and he wanted, he wanted something for the company. But he also told me, and he said, in the end, one of the things that I did was I just told the recording engineers and the people running the recording studio, Coltrane has an open door.
That's right.
And whatever he wants to do, he can come in, he can record this, and we'll pay for it. Doesn't make any difference what it is. And then he said, then Coltrane came up with Ascension, and which is a very, very intense, large ensemble piece.
Let's just say it ain't my favorite things.
It's not my favorite thing. But
All right,
and then,
we have that's
Bob Peel said that. Hold on, Bob.
Yeah, go ahead.
How am I gonna give this to my salesman? How are my salesmen going to sell it? And he said, or the salesman came and said, how are we going to sell this? He said, just put it in the record stores and people will buy it, and they did.
That's true.
He was a big champion of Coltrane's on both sides of that fence.
It's true. To be fair, it's very true. But there was a pressure that he didn't like to talk about, that he was doing that pressure.
Mm-hmm. All right, this is going to be our last question, and then I want to go to Steve for a minute to just talk briefly about his documentary on Coltrane, just briefly, because we're going to be bringing you back, Steve, as you know, in June. The last question is, can you discuss the connection between Coltrane and Ravi Shankar?
It's interesting because I've seen a number of people who wrote that Coltrane, his arrangement of My Favorite Things is very innovative. It's people think, oh, he played My Favorite Things. No, he totally reworked the tune. It has nothing to do with the way it's done on Broadway. It's absolutely brilliant. And they say it sounds like it's influenced by Indian music, but Train himself said, I didn't know much about Indian music then. I really learned about that in 1961. Well, that's interesting. That's a year later. At least that's his own wording. And what happened is, in my book, you'll see everything that's known about his connection with Ravi is in my book. I see there's also a question about his death. I talked to physicians, and I got very, very specific details about Coltrane's death. And it was not cirrhosis, by the way. It was cancer. And but look in the book. There's a lot of information about that from physicians. But what I will say about Ravi Shankar is it was unfortunately a kind of never quite happened. So I did some research on Ravi Shankar. I found out his first trip to the United States was December 61. I don't know if his first trip, but the trip to where Train met him was December 61. And I actually found an interview of Train in French where he said, in November, he said, I'm looking forward to getting back to New York in December because I'm going to meet Ravi Shankar. But what happened is they sat and talked for a few minutes, and then they both had to go somewhere. Then again, 1965, sat and talked for a few minutes, never had to go somewhere. So was Coltrane interested in Indian music? Well, for God's sake, his son is named Ravi, right? My friend
Right.
Ravi Coltrane. He loved Indian music. He was really interested in it. But it was kind of a general inspiration. He never got a specific a chance to really study it in depth, although he was interested in different scales. And when you learn different scales, he did learn a few Indian scales in this. So kind of a relationship that never quite flowered, but there was something to it for sure.
Okay, Steve, you want to talk a little bit about your documentary on John Coltrane?
Sure. We got 5 hours.
No, well, we got about 5 minutes, and then
What should I tell you?
well, because when you're done, I'm going to show some web, URLs where they can go and if they want, get it. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things. The one thing that comes to mind is that being a documentary producer is difficult because funding for documentaries is difficult. And I kept pushing when I was working in radio, NPR, when they were first, they would call things documentaries, and they were not what I would call a documentary. They would be more like a music special.
That's
they
interesting.
would play 2 interviews and then whole cuts of, they actually had a rule about you had to play the whole track. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. You can't play a whole track in a documentary. You got to play an excerpt of the music that illustrates what the person is talking about, and then you keep moving.
Right.
So getting funding for documentaries was always difficult. And the Coltrane documentary was not really intended to become the Coltrane documentary. I did a 1-hour documentary on Coltrane many years ago called Remembering Train. And I always wanted to go back and do a really comprehensive, deep dive overview of Coltrane's whole life. I got the opportunity to do something like that on Miles Davis. And then I started on one on Leonard Bernstein. And the Miles was 8 hours. The Bernstein is longer, it's 11 hours. In the middle of the Bernstein one, I ran out of money, and I went to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and asked them for more help, and they said no. And then my good friend Marty Kahn came up with some money, and he said, Steve, I got a little bit of money. How about doing a Coltrane doc? And I said, hey, well, we can't do a whole documentary for that amount. I said, but it's very generous, and I could definitely use the money. So my original plan was to do a sort of an audio essay, thinking about why are we still talking about Coltrane, like we are now. And that was my original. And then I called up the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and I said, well, could you give me money for a Coltrane documentary? And they said, yeah. So here I was. I didn't have enough money to finish the Bernstein one, but they gave me more money to do one on Coltrane. So now I'm working on 2 documentaries at the same time, which made 0 sense to me. But then, so the original idea of the Coltrane was going to be 1 hour and then 2 hours and then 4 hours. And then my very gifted and wonderful production and writing partner, Larry Abrams, and we said, well, we'll just end up making it 5 hours. But we never planned it out as a really comprehensive thing, which is why it is the way it is. And I'm very proud of it and I love it. And I think, but it's not the same comprehensive walking through step by step by step. There are gaps in it, but I think that's okay.
Oh, it's great. Yeah.
Well, I can't, well, we're going to, before, I wanted to show everybody Lewis's book. So you can, and then Lex is our technician. He's out of Temple University. Thank you, Lex, for working with us. He's going to put up an image for you to get the URLs. Here we go. We got, you can go to bookshop.org to get John Coltrane, His Life and Music. And I'm pretty sure they can get the reference book there too, Lewis. And bookshop.org is important because they support independent bookstores. And you can also go to Lewis's website and at lewisporter.com. And then Steve Rowland Media.com gives you a whole rundown on what Steve's been up to. I mean, I was really surprised by the Shakespearean angle there, Steve.
Absolutely.
So I'm assuming, Steve, that they can get to your documentaries through this site. Is that true?
Actually, the site to go for that is artistowned.com. Artist owned.
Is there a dash?
Artistowned.com.
No, it's one word.
Oh, one word. Okay.
Artist owned with an ED at the end.
Yeah, in fact, Suzanne, just before we started, Steve asked me a question. He said, Lou, to be or not to be?
That's right.
I said, really? This is where we're going now?
Yeah.
The last URL is our website, phillyjazzhistory.org, which I'd love you to put bookmark it on your computer because we're doing an awful lot of things. And if something pops in your mind, oh, I have this picture I took at the showplace, or oh, I taped this concert at the at this club, all that jazz. Oh, okay. Contact us, and we'd love to digitize it. We're going for a Grammy grant right now, so we can for some to digitize some tapes by Charlie Rice, the drummer, and Jimmy McGriff, the organist, and some other and Sam Reed, saxophonist. Also, I wanted to let you know who's coming next month. I don't have a specific date, but it's going to be Max Otester with Brewery Town Records and Monette Sudler. and they're going to be talking about how Max rescued the Sounds of Liberation record.
Beautiful.
Fired Lancaster and Conjamal, and his work rescuing old tapes of Philadelphia musicians, jazz musicians, that have been kind of lost to history. So that should be really an important conversation next month. But if you go to our website, there'll be a thing that pops up that says you want to sign up for our monthly newsletter. Just put your email in there and sign up, and you'll get all the information about our next shows. Um, okay, so I want to thank everybody, Lewis and Steve Rowland. I mean, you guys were great tonight. Thank you so much. And of course, I'm putting up the big ask. You can make a tax deductible donation to help us build together the Philadelphia Jazz Archive at phillyjazzhistory.org/donate. So we have a lot of great programs coming up monthly for you. So please sign up for our email and you'll know what each one of them is, and they're all free. So I wish there was a way everybody could clap, Lewis and Steve, because you guys are wonderful.
We'll clap for them.
All right, thanks for everybody coming out. I appreciate it.